Hi and welcome to the next episode of Everyone Can Garden. Today we're going to look at 3 easy steps to compost. So like everyone, some of you may be very keen in composting. So the 3 easy steps are: number 1 is what to compost, number 2 how to compost, and number 3 what tools that you need to have to compost. Now, for me, composting has to be done in a high-rise building with very little space, and the amount of stuff that I have to compost is very limited. So I make do with what I have and I compost with that. So today's video is all about what I have and how I compost using that. I hope this video is going to be absolutely useful for you if you're very keen in composting. In the first step, let's look at what to compost. So to me, I have 4 items that I usually have to compost. Number 1, food scraps. Number 2, coffee ground. Number 3, shredded newspaper. And number 4 is dried leaves. So these are the 4 things that I have to compost. Now you may have many. You may have a larger compound. You may have even manure. You may have sawdust. You may have many other stuff, which I'm not going to talk about it because I didn't use it and I don't know. So what I'm actually sharing in this video is all about what I have used and what I am comfortable in using. The second step, how to compost. Now, composting is a composition of managing carbon and nitrogen. In an ideal compost, there are about 30 parts of carbon to 1 part of nitrogen. And why it's 30 to 1? Because 30 to 1 creates optimum heat in the compost that you are making. When there is an optimum heat, the compost that you're making breaks down very fast, and then it turns out to be a beautiful compost. But if you tend to not balance the carbon to nitrogen, what happens is that if you have a higher carbon, then you generate less heat for it to break down, which means it's harder for it to break down. Or if you have a higher nitrogen, you create more heat for it to break down. So more heat will also lead to slowness in breakdown, a little bit of smellness. If you have higher carbon, likewise too, which is slowness to break down, smell, and the odor may not be that good as well. So the ideal composition is extremely important. Now, how do you know what has how much of carbon to nitrogen? Very simple. So I told you the 4 items that I compost. So let me give you the carbon to nitrogen part of the items that I compost. Food scraps. These are all vegetable scraps, including fruits. There's no meat product in food scraps. Meat products are completely excluded from food scraps. So these are all vegetable and fruits and any peels that you have. That's vegetable scraps, which is food scraps, and that's about 15 to 1. 15 carbon to 1 nitrogen. And then coffee ground. Coffee ground is about 20 carbon to 1 nitrogen. And then you have shredded newspaper. Shredded newspaper has got high composition of carbon, which is about 170 to 1 nitrogen. And then dried leaves. Dried leaves usually have up to 80 carbon to 1 nitrogen. So you have an idea right now of how much of carbon to nitrogen is all about here. And then we're going to talk about how we're going to mix them up. how we're going to mix them up is very simple. Now, it's a bit complicated to see 20 to 1, 15 to 1, 80 to 1 and 170 to 1, but let me teach you very simple step as to how you can measure how much of food scrap that you need to put, and you balance with either the shredded newspaper or the dried leaves. So I usually measure 1 handful of food scrap is equivalent to 1 handful of dried leaves, or 2 handful of food scraps equals to 1 handful of shredded paper. Now, using this, you can expand it with the level of measurement that you have. So that should be able to help you to balance your compost. Okay, so now we're going to look at the third step, which is the item that you need to have in order for you to compost. Okay, so what I should have, or what you should have in terms of items are that first you need to have a bucket. So I have at least 2 of them, so that once this is done, I'll go to the other one, and then once that is done, I'll come back to this one. So now in this bucket here, you should and you must make a hole. This is about 1 millimeters, or really 1.5. Now look at all these holes here that I've made. So now why I make these holes? Because the bucket should have proper ventilation of air. Now when you put your scraps in here, what's important is that when you give a proper mix and when you close this bucket, the work is done after that, which means that you need to give enough air and ventilation for the whole breakdown process to happen. And what happens is that when you don't make a hole at the bottom here, the discharge from the scraps will not be able to get out from here, so that the scrap can actually be a bit more drier. And I have a scoop like this. Obviously you need a scoop like this so that you can use and mix them up. Some people have a longer scoop, but I'm fine with this. You use either a plastic glove or a disposable glove, where once you use it, you throw it. I don't recommend you to use a bare hand. Now it's fine, but it's important to keep cleanliness. Here is the cover. So this cover is what we're going to use to close this. Now apologies that this is the bucket that I've used the last time, and these are quite dirty because this is what I've used, so apologies for that. Now we're going to look at how we're going to mix the food scraps with the items that I have mentioned earlier. Okay, here we are. So these are the food scraps that I have. What I would recommend you is that in these food scraps that I have about, I think, 8 bags here. Now what I would recommend you to do is that whenever you have a food scrap at home, try to make sure that you cut it small and keep it into small pieces before you even be putting it into this bag. Sometimes the moment you start putting it into the bag, and then when you try to cut it later, it's sort of already be a bit more smelly, so you wouldn't want to touch it first. Now I also have 1 bag full of dried leaves, and I also have 1 bag of shredded newspaper. There you go. These are the shredded newspaper that I have. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, that I said if you have 2 handful of food scraps, you can use 1 handful of shredded newspaper. I have 5 handful of shredded newspaper in here. I have 10 handful of dried leaves in here. When I measured this, this has about 20 handful. The whole of scraps has about 20 handful of scraps. So for 20 handful of scraps, I have 10 handful of dried leaves and 5 handful of shredded newspaper. That's what I'm going to mix in terms of composition. Alright, so how I'm going to mix this? First of all, I'm going to put all the dried leaves at the bottom. So I put all the dried leaves in here. Now I'm going to basically put all the food scraps into this. Okay, that's done. Now what's important is that you need to have a small bucket at the bottom, which is a bucket like this. The reason why I recommend you to have is so that the water doesn't spill like this. Now the last part is the shredded paper. I'm going to put all the shredded paper here. Now we're going to use the scoop and give it a good mix so that the component of the dried leaf, the food scraps and the shredded newspaper gets a good mixture. So this is exactly how the compost is after a good mixture. So you've got the shredded paper, you've got the dried leaves, and you've got the food scraps. Now we're done with the composting. What we're going to do, we're going to close this bucket. So we're done with this bucket. We've closed it. Now we're going to give it for the whole composting to work. It's going to heat up. Basically, we have given it a balanced mix of carbon to nitrogen. Well, I'm going to basically put this to the side and I'm going to leave it for 2 weeks, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to stir it one more round so that the mixture gets equally mixed in the bucket. Okay, we've come to the end of today's episode of 3 easy steps to composting. I hope the 3 steps that I've shared with you are all quite useful, and I would love to see you composting after this. I hope this video was helpful for you, and I welcome you to start composting and you too contribute to your part of lesser emission to the environment. Bye, and see you in the next video.